Right now, a conflict is choking the world's most critical energy artery. The shockwaves, they're only just beginning to be felt. Today, we're unpacking the crisis in the Strait of Hormuz and what it really means for you, me, and the entire global economy.
So here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at why this little stretch of water is so incredibly important. Then, we'll see what happens when the tap is suddenly turned off. We'll track who ends up paying the price, zoom in on India's unique balancing act, and finally, search for a way out of this mess. Before we dive in, I want you to just lock this number into your head. 20.9 million. That's how many barrels of oil used to pass through the Strait of Hormuz every single day. We're talking about a fifth of all the petroleum the entire world consumes. All right, let's get right into our first section, the world's oil artery. And that description, the planet's economic jugular vein, is no exaggeration. So what is the Strait of Hormuz? Well, think of it as this tiny, narrow bottleneck that connects the oil-rich Persian Gulf to the rest of the planet. And for the colossal amount of oil coming out of that region, there's just no other easy way out. It makes this little passage absolutely indispensable. And you've got this small handful of massive oil producers who completely depend on this one route. Saudi Arabia is the giant, of course, making up almost 40% of the flow. But you've also got Iraq, the UAE, Iran, Kuwait. It's just this immense concentration of the world's energy supply, all funneling through one very, very vulnerable spot. Which leads to the big question, what actually happens when that critical flow is suddenly cut off? That brings us to part two, the very real consequences of a 20% global supply shock. Well, the effect was, to put it mildly, immediate and explosive. Before all this, Brent crude oil was sitting at a stable $75 a barrel. Afterwards, it shot up to around $115. That's a 50% jump. And it wasn't just about a real shortage, it was driven by pure, unfiltered market panic. And to really get a sense of the scale here, this is not just another oil crisis. I mean, look at history. The infamous 1973 embargo, that cut global supply by 9%. The 1979 crisis was even smaller. What we're seeing now is a staggering 20% cut. It is 3 to 4 times bigger than the shocks that sent the world into recession in the past. So you have this massive supply shock. It creates global panic. But who's really feeling the pain? Who pays the price? Let's get into part 3. And this is really important to understand. The price hike hits everyone, sure, but the physical dependency, that's a whole different story. A whopping 80% of all the oil that leaves the Strait of Hormuz is headed for one place, Asia. Europe and the US have way less direct exposure. This puts Asia's economies right on the front lines. And for some countries, the situation is, well, it's about as extreme as it gets. Take Japan. Anywhere from 73 to over 90% of its total oil imports have to come through this single choke point. Its entire economy is almost totally hostage to a safe and secure Strait of Hormuz. You see a very similar and very worrying picture with South Korea. It's a global leader in tech and manufacturing, but it relies on the strait for about 70% of the oil that fuels its whole economy. That is a massive, massive vulnerability. And then there's China, the factory of the world, right? Even they are hugely exposed. Somewhere around 40 to 45% of their oil imports, that's nearly 8 million barrels of oil every single day, has to navigate this one waterway. A huge risk for the planet's second largest economy. All of this intense vulnerability in the region brings us to a really fascinating case study, India. It's a story of both smart diversification and unavoidable vulnerability. You see, India's strategy coming into this crisis was different. Even before the conflict, India had been making a very deliberate, strategic choice to diversify where it gets its oil. Russia, which doesn't use the Hormuz route at all, already made up nearly 40% of India's imports. This was a calculated move to create a buffer. But here's the catch, that strategic buffer, it can't shield you from the global price tag. Even with all that Russian oil, the price spike adds a staggering $100 billion, or even more, to India's annual import bill. That is just an enormous economic blow. And that $100 billion figure, that's not just some number on a spreadsheet. It hits home, it means fuel prices at the pump jump by 10 to 20%, it puts immense pressure on the Indian rupee, and it acts as a direct drag on the economy. potentially shaving off up to a full percentage point of GDP growth. So this is really the core of India's dilemma. Because of its smart diversification, especially with Russia, India is much less exposed to an actual physical shortage of oil compared to its neighbors like Japan or South Korea. But because oil is a global commodity with a global price, India is every bit as exposed to the financial pain of that price shock. Okay, so the stakes are incredibly high. The situation is dire. What's the path forward from here? That brings us to our final section, navigating the way forward. Well, the global response really breaks down into a three-stage playbook. First, in the short term, you have the emergency measures, things like releasing oil from strategic reserves, and of course, intense diplomacy to try and calm things down. Then, medium term, it's about doubling down on what India was already doing, finding even more diverse suppliers and building up reserves. And in the long term, well, the only real permanent fix is to simply use less oil by shifting to renewables and electric vehicles. But for all the talk about strategic shifts and long-term plans, the source material is crystal clear on one thing. The fastest, the most effective, and honestly, the cheapest fix is a swift diplomatic resolution to the conflict that's causing this whole crisis. And that really leaves us with the big question, doesn't it? In a world that's full of these geopolitical choke points, can we secure our energy future simply by talking at the negotiating table? Or do we have to fundamentally reinvent a relationship with energy itself to ever truly be secure?